Keep the speed going. Come on, Aki. Oh my days! Carries speed good though. Like I said, carries traction, or holds traction pretty well. Well, good news is the motor tune's pretty decent now. Feels a lot more natural, if there is such a thing, when it comes to e-bike motors. But on the whole, the bike did pretty well. So yeah, fair play.
What's crack-a-lacking, guys and girls? Hopefully everyone's doing alright. I know I am. I guess it's about high time I give you guys a initial opinion as to the Dengfu E22. So before I actually do that, I've got to give a huge shout out to everyone who's been digging the Bafang M620 content as well as the Dengfu E22 content, because I ain't gonna lie, part of me was thinking to myself, do I want to do this? But from what I've been able to gauge, the reception's been pretty good actually, and I do appreciate all the kind words and all the thumbs ups and such. So if you've been digging this content, again, many thanks. And I've also got to give a huge shout out to every person and all the companies I've been able to work with. You know, Works Components for the 2-degree angle headset, the Slackerizer headset for the Dengfu E10, which we'll touch upon in a second, Titan Pro for the motor. You know, it's always nice to actually try and use UK brands in order to source a lot of the components as opposed to relying primarily on the Far East or further afield. So yeah, many thanks to everyone who's been contributing towards that. And again, if you've been digging the content, again, smash that like button and of course comment down below. In addition, in anticipation of this video, I also have made the Dengfu E22 frame thread, which I've gone through all my experiences with the Dengfu E22 frame so far. I'll be keeping that thread updated as much as possible. And in anticipation of the Dengfu E22 versus the Dengfu E10 video and my thoughts and opinions regarding that, I'll be sure to update that thread as well. Anyway, as I was saying, I got to give you guys my thoughts and opinions of the Dengfu E22 right now. Now, at this time of me making this video, I've put 300 miles through the motor. So yeah, 300 miles. Taking the bike in pretty much a wide range of terrain, trails, bike parks. The bike's been pretty, I'm not gonna lie, the bike's been pretty cool. I was a bit reluctant to really start messing around with carbon, and in anticipation of me messing around with the Dengfu E22 on my 33rd birthday, I even bought a specialized S-Works Enduro just so I could familiarize myself with the connotations of going with carbon. I mean, you've heard of the whole spiel of, you know, carbon's stiffer, it's lighter, so on and so forth, and to a certain extent that's true, but then as soon as you start adding the net weight of the e-bike motor and the battery and such, actually, part of you then has to ask yourself, are the weight savings going to be really worth it? Because isn't it going to be negated somewhat? Surely the weight savings aren't going to be worth it. I mean, obviously, you know, as soon as you slap in an M620 motor, as soon as you slap in that 840 watt-hour battery, it's just going to weight the bike down so heavily. But then I think it's only when you have the frame to hand you realise the reasons why they've gone with carbon on this platform, because they've been able to take liberties as to how they've been able to construct certain things. Like, for example, I've never owned a Bafang e-bike with onboard charging facilities. Usually, whatever onboard charging facilities you have been more through the battery, where you've had to plug it in and the battery has been semi-exposed in order for you to get into the port. The Dengfu E22, as well as the Dengfu E10 to be fair, they have those onboard charging facilities where you can see that they've actually cut through a hole dedicated for that facility. And obviously if they were to try to do that with alloy, then it would somewhat structurally compromise the frame. Obviously, you don't really want to start doing that, because then that's where you start having cracks and so on and so forth. But you can tell that in the key areas where they've done that, it's kind of paid off, and it's a, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a gimmick. More so, it's actually pretty nice, because at times I don't fancy kind of trailing a cable through in order to find a dedicated port and then plug in the battery, or plug in the cable into the bike and then charging it that way. Sometimes you just want to know that for easy access, you can just plug it in wherever, or have the option of removing the battery, take it in, charge it inside, and then put the battery back in the bike, and then off you go. But yeah, on the Dengfu E22, the charging facilities is located on the left side of the seat tube, just above the motor. Convenient, easy to access. Questionable as to whether or not it is the ideal place. I mean, after all, it is an ENTB, so one could argue that it's right there, prone to, where mud and any kind of foreign debris could get into that area. But I've thrashed the E22 around. I've not shied away from it going near water. Like, the onboard charging facility is fine. I was going to say, if you can hear like a little fuzzy noise in the background, actually that's the battery charging. It's not the E22's battery, it's actually the E10. I'm actually looking at the E10 right now, actually, but I'll address the E10 in a different video. But I guess what you guys want to know is how the bike rides, and I gotta be honest, it rides better than what I initially thought it was going to. Actually, the chainstay length kind of portrays it as it's going to be so sluggish in certain circumstances, and to be honest with you, the E10, it shares the same rear end as the E22, so one could argue that whatever negatives or issues the E10 has, the E22 is going to have as well. But from what I'm able to gauge between the two bikes, not only do they ride differently, but the rear ends, they feel different as well. Like, don't get me wrong, obviously being as they're sharing the same rear ends, the rear axle path, it moves in the same direction, but in terms of certain connotations, probably more derived by the layout of the rear shock, the placement of the E22, where it's below the top tube, whereas the E10, it's connected onto the down tube. The platforms are just so different. The rear wheel can track the ground a lot better, I feel, on the E22 as opposed to the E10, whereas the E10 just feels more supportive in terms of pedaling efficiency, which I'd say it doesn't make the bikes different. More so, it just adds an interesting dynamic as to what you could ultimately explore regarding the platforms. I mean, for example, if someone were to ask me right now, although I'm going to be testing this a little bit more, as to which one I feel would be more coil optimized, I would be leaning more towards the E22, just for traction alone, as to what I'm able to gauge. But I have seen some people who've slapped coils on the Dengfu E10, unclear as to whether or not it makes the bike track the ground even more, gives a more supple response. But I'll be playing around with that over the next couple of months and so. By no means, I'm not here to provide a review as to the Dengfu E22, because it's April as to when I'm making this video, and obviously I built the bike up, what was it, February, I think, or February or March, one of the two anyway. But I've had more time on the E22 as opposed to the E10, and so I know that I've been able to work that aspect out between the two as to what I can recognize, but there's further playing around as to what I need to do. In addition, one thing I will gladly say is that with the E10, I have taken the same preferential treatment in terms of amending the head tube angle. So with the E22, I used the 2-degree angle headset from Works Components, which fits. With the E10, I went with the Slackerizer by Superstar Components. Both companies are UK based, and it was kind of nice to actually have a little bit of UK inspiration in terms of the build process between the two frames. I mean, I recognise that essentially the frames, they're from the Far East. Bafang motor, it's not a Bafang battery, but it's a battery which is designed with the Dengfu frames. It's obviously a Dengfu frame in its entirety. So it's just nice to actually, have some, different sources in the bikes as well. Like, I'm running the One Up 210 dropper seat post. One Up is a Canadian brand, ODI, American. My bar and stems, they're different between the two bikes, but I'm running the DMR Defy stem on the E22. On the E10, I want to say it's just a generic 3540 stem I've got on there, but we'll touch upon that again when I do the comparisons. It's the reasons why I've changed things around as for preferences. But like I said, as for the ride for the E22, yeah, it rides, like I said, better than what I initially anticipated. I think it was the lonewolf.com who came up with that category, you know, wolf in sheep's clothing. And if you were to just simply confine your research online and just looking at the geometry chart, which I ain't gonna lie, that geometry chart is somewhat misleading. Like the reach, I don't know who's measuring what, but I'll gladly say the large Dengfu E22, it does not have a reach of 470. It's way longer. Like, just for reference, a reach of 470, that's kin to my Gen 1 Levo. I will gladly say the E22 is way longer than my XL, Gen 1 Levo. It's actually longer than my Gen 1 Canevo. And I know a lot of people are probably thinking to themselves, that's not really saying much, but believe me, like, if you were to, again, just confine your research just by the geometry chart alone, that's what you're thinking. But it's only when you have the frame to hand, you build it up, you realize, actually, no, man, this is a bit longer than I initially anticipated, actually. And so therefore, you gotta sometimes take liberties. Like, you know, I've taken liberties as to how these bikes have been built up. Again, 210 1-up dropper seat post. And without being funny, you know, like, I'm running a 200mm dropper seat post on my Gen 1 Levo and my Gen 1 Levo hardtail. I'm running a 170 in the Canevos. So, you know, I've built those things up even more to accommodate me as a tall rider of 6'3" with a 35 leg inch inseam. But yeah, the bike rides really, really well. You know, so much I've done with that bike in terms of what I've done, how I've ridden it. Like, you know, hook to flats, nose dives, stair challenges, high speed, stability. You know, carving through corners. That is an experience. Like, there's only one other e-bike I've ever been able to literally just rip through a corner and know that my exit speed has been literally the same as my entry speed. Like that, and that's the white E150 V1s. Like, I've never experienced that on any other type of e-bike I've ever tried, and yet the E22, it replicated that. And you could argue that, yeah, fine, I've taken liberties to how I built it, but again, it was like, I never thought that, well, I never thought that I'd be able to emulate that, put it that way. And without sounding funny, like, you know, I love white as a brand, but essentially I've built up my E22 way cheaper than what I would buy a white E150 or an E160 or an E180. So yeah, but having said that though, I mean, like, the bike is proper decent. It is the wolf in sheep's clothing. I'd say the only thing which I am reminded, a lot of people will obviously always say, but it's kind of more off-putting, is the weight. There is the connotations as to the motor and the legalities from that. You know, I'm not going to go into that too diligently. Oh, looks like my battery's charged. I'm not going to go into that too diligently because I know what remits I've taken in order to ensure that, you know, the motors, for me, my M620s are legal. And I can cover that in a separate video if you want, because obviously I've got avenues to program it, and, you know, it's not a case in which I'm misinterpreting the EAPC legislations. I'm fully aware as to what they outline, but I know that my motor's 250 watt nominal, 750 watt peak, maximum current of 20 amps. So, you know, it's not going to achieve nowhere near as to what the power the M620 is usually revered as. But I know that they're legal. They're legal. If anything, the M600, I see people rocking those. That's where I'm thinking to myself, technically they're illegal, because programming them in order to adhere to the EAPC legislation, that's a little bit more tricky. It's doable, but it's a little bit more tricky. But nonetheless, anyway, I mean, bike is amazing. For me, it works, and I'm reminded that, like, you know, I've tried the bike and others, and, you know, whatever I've been able to explain in terms of, like, feeling and feedback as to what the bike gives you, how the bike rides in certain circumstances, others have kind of said, you know what, I kind of see where you're coming from, actually. And, you know, like, there's been riders who can ride more aggressively than me. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like, there's people who've ridden the bike and, without sounding funny, but it looks like they just wanted to try and ride the bike in an effort to destroy it. And I've even said to them, I was like, look, ride the bike as you would. Just ride the bike as you would. Like, you know, if we have to, like, fiddle around with things like saddle rail position, stem height, or anything along those lines, bar roll tilt, you know, we can do that, but just ride the bike as you would. And, like, I've seen craziness with the E22 being used, like, people just, like, fling the thing off things, you know, and believe me that the bike still works, the bike still functions. Like, if anything, one could argue that I'm kind of thankful that I took the provisions in order to put frame wrap on it just to preserve the frame as much as possible. But it's walked away. It's walked away from it. So I'm impressed. I'm honestly impressed. Dengfu, if you're watching this, I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Dengfu E10, on the other hand, we'll get to that again in a different video. But the E22, you know, the one standout thing I will gladly say from it is that it looks like whatever connotations has been derived negative-wise from the E10, despite the fact that they do share similarities, especially the rear ends, but it looks like it has been addressed regarding the E22. The only gripe which one could argue is that, unlike the E10s, both the V1s and the V2s, because I'm aware that there is a new variant of the Dengfu E10 which will soon be taking delivery of very soon, is that the head tube as well as certain aspects of the geometry have changed. And so I'm curious in seeing whether or not there's ever other areas in which they've tweaked the internal workings of the frame. But it looks like the E22 has addressed a couple of issues which I've been able to observe from the E10, and so I'm thankful with that. Mind you, I am reminded that, you know, between the two frames, both are using metric rear shocks, but essentially one is running 230 and one's running 210. And so I was always thinking to myself, have Dengfu kind of missed the trick in terms of both either using 230 or both just using 210 essentially, because both of them are only giving 150 millimeters of rear wheel travel. But it was only when I actually studied the frames more intricately I understand the reason why the E10 uses a 210 and why the 230 is reserved for the E22 and technically the E23 as well. I know some people have asked me about the E23. I'll be honest with you, I can't say that it's similar to the E22 or the E10. Obviously, I know that the boost hub spacing, it's not on the E23 because that's using a fat bike specific standard, but it wouldn't surprise me if, say, like the mech hanger and the bearings and the linkage to a certain extent are somewhat similar. But I can look into that. I am in touch with Dengfu, and they've been obviously kind enough in order to provide me with some information as to the frame so far. So I'll share my findings as and when I can. And again, link in the description to the E22 frame thread on ENTV forums. But you know what, I'm going to wrap it up here anyway, guys. As you can see from the beginning of the video, I've just been having a blast with the bike. And you know what, the last month in which I've just been using the bike more or less religiously, like in my weekends and just here and there, it's been enough for me to gauge the bike so that I can understand exactly where the bike is going to excel. I'm not going to say what it excels at this point, because I wouldn't mind fiddling around with certain components just to see whether or not certain things are more favorable. I know one person has asked me if I could mullet the E22, and one person has asked me if I could run it as a full 29er, and that will happen. But for how I've built it up, and you could argue that it's built up a little bit conservatively in conjunction with the components I've had lying around, especially the E10 as well. I'm looking at that. But even so, it's not bad. It's kind of an eye-opener that in 2022, you don't have to spend the earth and then some in order to get something which is just as capable as what the mainstream EMTBs are offering. Yes, there's no adjustable geometry in the bike, so one could argue that you have to set them up perfectly before you can start going to trail centers or bike parks or doing your all-day epics. But once you've got it dialed in and you've had that decent acclimation period, you soon discover what the bikes can truly do. And I'll gladly say, like, you know, in terms of me taking the bike outside of its intended use, it's coped, it survived, and it lives to tell the tale. So yeah, I'm impressed so far. But like I said, guys, I'm going to wrap it up here. Hopefully this video has been insightful for anyone. Again, huge shout out to everyone who I've been working with so far. Titan Pro, Works Components, Superstar Components, the list goes on. I do apologize if I'm getting my words mixed up, but in all honesty, you know, their contributions have made these projects a hell of a lot more speedily than what I would have dared thought. So yeah, give yourself that thumbs up if you know you've contributed, and again, give yourself that thumbs up if you've been digging the content so far. But like I said, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks for watching, guys, and until the next time, take it easy, stay safe, peace be the journey, #FABT, and I will catch you then. Peace.